Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and this is March 28th, 2018. Had to scramble to find the theme to turn it down. Nothing changes around here. Tonight, a View Up Here backgrounder on Bill C-69, the latest revision of Canada's environmental approval game. Yes, I believe so, Nick. It's probably in the miscellaneous. Now, Team Trudeau made a lot of big promises on the campaign trail. Promises to set things right, to promote transparency, to create things for the future that will be clear and straightforward. Well, we're pretty much midway point, and delivering compared to promising is nothing to get real excited about. Have there been any changes? Well, yeah, some in, visible methods. The previous government made their priorities and more or less rammed them through without dissent from within or without. Ask Inky Mark, ask Brent Rathgeber, ask Hugh Siegel. And despite claiming to be pro-Canada, pro-big oil, the environmental approval process was a gong show. But Sunny Ways is here. As soon as they got in, the Liberals said, we know this process doesn't work. So they did what we are seeing an awful lot from this government. They started a process of consultation, traveling the country, town halls, staffers running around collecting input, online contributions, lots of information. And anybody who took part in the Electoral Reform process knows that this is a ruse. The official title for C-69 is an Act to enact the Impact Assessment Act and the Canadian Energy Regulator Act, to amend the Navigation Protection Act, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. Okay. Other acts? Yeah, 30 of them. Changing 31 acts, creating 2 new ones, eliminating a couple old ones in 412 pages. You know what this is called? By definition, this is omnibus legislation. Something the Liberals promised, there's that word again, that they would not do if they formed government. It's hard to see much coming out about this right now because it's so big, it's taking people time to go through it and come up with a reasonable, balanced assessment and criticisms and praise. The National Energy Board is replaced by the Canadian Energy Regulator. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012, which everybody loves so much, is replaced by the Impact Assessment Act. There's a lot to this, and there's a lot to talk about. That's why this is a backgrounder, because, hey, I just don't have what it takes to really get into this, but there's a lot of stuff people should be paying attention to. But as I said in the last couple promotions before the show went live, this is a special update on the rebirth of Free Anons. Listeners and people in the community will remember that last Christmas Eve was rather incendiary in the internet radio community that I still belong to. I don't belong to as much of it as I did a few months ago. There was an issue about the organization Free Anons. What has happened to them over the years? Why? What can be done? There were 3 people involved in the direct production of that episode, and before we came up with the title, we had 2 in mind. What happened to Free Anons, which is the one we ended up going with, and the other one was Tango Down Free Anons. Of course, we liked that one better, but as one of the 3 people said, what if this doesn't work? What if nobody cares? Then we look stupid. So we figured, okay, yeah, there's been enough attacks for the last week, threats, etc. Yeah, let's not overstep. Well, it's just a little more than 3 months since that show aired. There have been some changes. None of the threats directed at any of us have come to anything. The opposition, shall we say, on that broadcasting day has closed shop. I think the issue turned out to be is, did people care? I think the issue that proved correct is, did the right people care? I've been informed in the last few days that the entire administration of Free Anons, as it was when we made that show, has been purged. Free Anons is undergoing a restructuring and a new administration. It will return to its roots. 2 of the original founders are now in control of the Twitter account at Free Anons, the website, which I believe is currently down, freeanons.org, and that would be Nix and Jeremy Hammond are now going to lay out the direction for Free Anons. Even if you go to their Twitter feed or their page, you'll see that things have changed. There is no longer any direct promotion of any fundraising efforts. It is back to what it used to be. From my opinion, I feel somewhat vindicated. We were right. But the right thing has happened. So that's all over. It's time to move on. Congratulations, Nix. Well deserved. Now, back to the show. Environment was one of the big things that Trudeau Liberals talked about on the campaign trail, along with other things. As I said, very few of them have come to fruition in 2.5 years. We'll see. An election will be coming, which is always a great time to come through on some of those promises before people start bringing them up and asking about them. The Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, has not exactly had an easy task. An awful lot of abuse on social media. And not an overly friendly portrayal from corporate media. And not a very easy job if you're going to clean up the system we had. But they've been trying. And being a political party, they will play their cards the way they see fit. Now, I've got a few excerpts from an interview that Minister McKenna did recently when she was out in Vancouver for a climate meeting. This was on the CBC. Anybody who lives in BC is going to know what show this is from, but I don't know what I did with it. I don't have it. I don't know what show it was or who the host was, for which I apologize. But this is from CBC in Vancouver. The first clip I'm going to play is something that the Liberals are using more and more about all of their promises, and I basically call it Be Afraid.
So whether or not it comes to our pipeline, see, people are still using fossil fuels. We're in this. What? Yeah, get back. I know I'm repeating the transition piece, but we need to fund this transition, and stopping one pipeline, which fits within our climate plan. Let's be clear. We looked at, and we make decisions based on science and evidence. It fits within our climate plan. But Canada standing alone and saying, okay, we're going to take this stance. We're not. This pipeline that was approved isn't going to go ahead. That's not going to change the world. Yeah. What's going to change the world is if we get Canadians on board, they understand that we need to put a price on pollution, that there's a huge economic opportunity, and that we're going to take advantage of that. And that takes time. And I worry that we're going to lose the opportunity if we're not focused and we just put all our attention on one project. No, we've got to change the world. And the world is changing. Who would have thought that we would be talking about the end of the internal combustion engine, that we won't be using gas in cars? So we had a review. We've been working extremely hard over 2 years to figure out how do we do a better job of reviewing major projects. There were concerns with the National Energy Board, and we heard them loud and clear that people weren't having the opportunity to go and express their concerns. We heard that people were concerned that decisions weren't being made on science and evidence. And of course, you need to take into account climate impacts, and also that we have a responsibility to Indigenous peoples, that they need to be meaningfully consulted and part of projects. And then on the business side, business said, look, we need clarity. We need a clear process. We need to know that decisions aren't going to be made on a political basis. They actually want decisions to be made based on science and evidence. And we want it to be timely. And we want to know that good projects are going to go ahead. We started, as I said, with the interim principles when we came in as a government. We felt that it was important to have one agency that was ultimately responsible. So we will work with the Canadian Impact Assessment Agency. We'll work with the National Energy Board. That's a life cycle regulator, so they're important. They play a role throughout the whole project. But ultimately, the decision, there's one agency that's responsible for the process to bring coherence. We're going to be working directly with provinces so that you're not providing material to provinces and then coming back and providing the same material to us at a different time. We're going to make sure that you have certainty about what Indigenous communities you need to be consulting with. You'll understand what permits you'll be needing, and it'll be shorter because you'll have more certainty. And the whole goal of this, because you see a lot of polarization when people don't trust a process, is to get to a better spot. That it's not good to have people, screaming at each other, and most Canadians are reasonable. I understand, this is hard, and that's why I spent a lot of time talking about our vision. We are in a transition. So transitions, they don't happen overnight. We know we need to be ambitious, but you need to get people on board. And in the case of Alberta, as I say, you have a province who has taken really credible, serious action while still trying to ensure that people have jobs. They're making investments in a cleaner future. They understand they need to diversify the economy. And they need to make sure that, they're bringing people along, and they're doing a very good job. And that's the same in most provinces, that we're all working to figure this out together. And we're not the only country that's doing this. Every country is trying to figure this out. Take a country like Germany that relies significantly on coal. The big discussion there is they decided to get off nuclear. They're relying on coal. How do they do that? Every country has their own challenges in a transition, but we all know we need to be doing this, and you need Canadians to understand that we care greatly about climate change. That's why we're doing hard things. So, in this context, we're talking about the twinning of one pipeline.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And people, as I say, are still using fossil fuels. And we're working with Alberta. And I'm very concerned right now that we're at risk of losing our climate plan, that you have two progressive NDP governments in Alberta and BC who are absolutely committed to climate action, but in one province, they're trying to figure out the transition. And we might lose this climate plan, weirdly, because progressives are fighting. That's not a good place to be, because on the other side, I have folks that, and you can go visit my trolls on Twitter, but other folks attacking us for doing anything on climate change. And that's where the role of the federal government is, to try to be calmer and try to figure out what is the path forward, working with provinces and territories, working with cities who have been real leaders on climate action, working with businesses, working with environmentalists to figure out the way forward, to try to not ratchet down the politics and the overheated rhetoric, which is completely unhelpful on both sides, I will say, and get us to where we need to go, which is ensure a more sustainable future and also have a strong economy and good jobs. So our government understands that the environment and the economy go together, and that's not just a catchphrase, that in the 21st century, if you want to get your resources to market, you need to show you're doing it in a sustainable way, and you can do that. And not every project is going to meet that threshold, but for example, the Kinder Morgan pipeline, it's the twinning of an existing pipeline. When we came into government, we were clear that we needed to make sure that we had a more robust system to look at it. We did much more consultation. We made sure there was meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples. We said we would make decisions based on science and evidence, and we did. And that project was also looked at in light of our climate plan, so it fits within our climate plan. And I should give a shout out to the government of Alberta. It's a progressive NDP government that brought in the first ever hard cap on emissions in the oil sands. It put a price on pollution, and it also phased out coal. And we've made investments in the example of Kinder Morgan in ocean protection. People wonder, well, wait a minute, you can only do the economy or you can only do the environment. And I will tell you in my job, which I love, there are people who say, I'm not really happy with the fact that you are bringing in these measures, that it's too expensive to take action on climate change, and I'm really worried about jobs and the economy, and that's a fair concern. On the flip side, I have other people who say, you're not going fast enough. We need to, right now, stop all projects. And I can understand that people have those views, but the reality is we need jobs. We need economic growth, and we also need to ensure that we're going to capture the $1 trillion economic opportunity that Mark Carney's talked about of clean growth, and also ensure a more sustainable future for our kids. I have 3 kids, so you can do both, but it requires thoughtful policies and recognizing it's a transition. Transitions don't happen overnight.
Now, that last clip, I'm not even going to mention all the qualifiers. And yes, I did have comments between a couple of those clips, and I had my goddamn microphone muted, so I apologize. The BTR archive will edit out the silence, thank God. What we heard through those clips was a vision, not a process, not a procedure. This is what this 412-page bill is about. It's about assessing energy infrastructure if they should be allowed to go forward. Now, they did do 16 months on the road and heard from countless panels and expert review and public input and everything else, which is exactly what happened with electoral reform. And then when all the data was collated, never mind what the committee did, but when then Minister of Democratic Reform, Mariam Monsef, went on the road and had her circus, it became very clear to anybody who attended these events that this wasn't going to happen. I mean, when I went to a town hall that the minister put on, I thought we were going to talk about electoral systems, the cons, the pros and cons of each. No, instead, all the people there were put into small groups, so all the government representatives could just walk around like teachers. And we were asked important, pressing questions like, what does democracy mean to you? We're talking about electoral reform. Quit fucking around. And then when mydemocracy.ca came out and people saw the idiotic questions on there, it was pretty clear that electoral reform would go nowhere. Have they done the same thing with C-69? Well, we'll see. This is early days, but we're seeing a very familiar pattern. The government has done a lot better than the previous one by making at least the progress and intent of these consultations available in a timely manner. Now, what they have so far with the bill and with the huge amount of input they gathered, they put something out called Better Rules for Major Projects Handbook. And it does, again, on paper, push what they're all about, our vision, blah, blah, blah. Clean environment and a strong economy go hand in hand. Yeah, well, every once in a while you hear people talking about the billions of dollars to be made in clean energy, but there's not a whole lot about that. That is something I'll mention right now. For all the times that Minister McKenna mentioned transition, there's absolutely nothing about transition in C-69 to give projects that encourage it specifically any recognition, to say that it's a factor that will be considered with approval as far as life cycle goes, or ability to change the project to different generation or transmission methods as they become available. No, nothing at all. This government put in place interim principles for project reviews in January 2016, then launched a comprehensive process in June 2016 to review existing laws and seek Canadians' input on how to improve the environmental and regulatory process. This aimed to address concerns about previous reforms to environmental assessments, loss protections for our fisheries and waterways, and the need to modernize the National Energy Board. The government has delivered on its promise by proposing better rules for environmental and regulatory processes. This milestone was informed by over 14 months of public, stakeholder, and Indigenous consultations, expert panel reports, and parliamentary studies. They make a statement about what they think this delivers. The new legislation reflects values that are important to Canadians, including early, inclusive, and meaningful public engagement, partnerships with Indigenous peoples, timely decisions based on the best available science and Indigenous traditional knowledge, and sustainability for present and future generations. There are people that would say that they've already broken that, but what else is new? They're a government. The early inclusive and meaningful public engagement part was what everybody was asking for after the Liberal government was elected in 2015 regarding Trans Mountain expansion. That's what they wanted. The Trudeau government said, no, that process is very close to being finished. We will let it finish under the rules it has, and then we'll make our decision. This reeks very much of the decision taken by the Horgan government in BC regarding Site C. Well, this is the information we have, and we've made our decision, with no consequence for the parameters of the information. Their statement of why they are doing this. Canada is blessed with abundant natural riches. Developed wisely, major resource projects can power economies, support communities, and create jobs. Developed without proper oversight, they can lead to environmental degradation, stranded assets, broken trust, and lost opportunities. So out of those four, which one affects Canadians? Environmental degradation, not the other three. Now they line out here what they say improvements are needed. More transparency and certainty that decisions would be based on robust science, evidence, and Indigenous traditional knowledge. More and earlier opportunities for meaningful participation by Indigenous peoples and Canadians. More Indigenous leadership of and partnership in project review. Impact assessment must look at all of a project's impacts to foster sustainability, including environmental, health, social, and economic impacts. More coordination with provinces to reduce red tape and avoid duplication, and more predictable and consistent timelines. Every one of these problems, in one form or another, have been a common complaint. The reason these problems existed is because the process that was in place simply did not allow for them. As far as project reviews go, Bill C-69 puts mandated. Is there a way for those limits to be avoided? Well, yes, of course, by ministerial directive. I mean, I'll explain this further as we go on, but I just want to make this clear. Even though there is a more apparently robust and open process, how many of those reviews will actually get to a panel that has more quasi-independence will have to be seen. And if there are fewer project reviews, then there is fewer opportunities because everything is accelerated. Even if the rules favor the side you're on, if you don't have time to present properly, to use those rules, what difference does it make? The Liberals recognize that there is a real problem with the way the environmental review process is in Canada when they inherited it. They stress as goals to protect the environment, regain public trust, strengthen our economy, and support reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Well, those four things seem to make sense. They have added something that fits with their governance theme, and it's called Gender-Based Analysis Plus. This is going to apply across all of government programs. And it's an analytical tool used to assess how diverse groups of women, men, and gender diverse people may experience policies, programs, and initiatives. For example, a GBA Plus analysis would study how the influx of male workers in a remote work camp could affect women living in nearby communities. Well, I would have to say from experience, that's not a bad idea. So they are adding a whole new dynamic to the approval process, but as we'll see, the time frames are mandated to be shorter than they ever were before. Now they have come up with a cute little process of 5 pictures. They are in the slideshow on the show page. I just like to say to Knickknack, that's pretty neat, man. Dogescape. Haven't seen that browser in a while. You know, Firefox is up to 59 now. There are 5 steps in this new proposed system. Step 1 is the early planning, up to a maximum of 180 days, which would have an impact assessment cooperation plan. Now, this could also include an Indigenous engagement and partnership plan and a public partnership plan. Here's the Liberal pattern. Lots of plans, lots of meetings. A tailored impact statement, guidelines to move forward, and a permitting plan if required. From there, it would go to the impact statement. Now, the proponent, the person asking for approval, at this stage, gets to take as much time as they need to present their case. Now, the proponent prepares a draft impact statement. The agency reviews it for conformity with the process and with impact statement guidelines and posts it on the registry for public comment. Once that's in, it's impact assessment. This is led by the Impact Assessment Agency, which will replace the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. The agency assesses the impact statement and prepares an impact assessment report, or, if it goes to a panel review, an assessment by the panel. If it's an agency-led impact assessment, it's a maximum of 300 days. If it's a review panel, it's a maximum of 600 days. Now we're going to skip that whole process just to move down their system flow chart. Step 4 is the decision making. Once the impact assessment is given by the agency or the review panel, once they're done, there are 30 days for a decision to be made if it's by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. That is not going to change from what Harper put in. Final decision will be with the Minister, or if the Minister doesn't want to take all the heat, it can be referred to Privy Council, the Cabinet. They get 90 days. But the bottom line is, for every major energy infrastructure project in Canada, the final decision is in the Cabinet room. It's not made by a board. It's not made by a commission. It's not made by a review panel or the agency they set up to do this. The final decision will rest with the Minister and Cabinet. Something else that's been sorely lacking for 40 years of these policies is what the Liberals are calling Step 5. Follow-up, monitoring, and compliance and enforcement. Anybody who's been following what's been going on with the construction at Site C knows exactly what compliance and enforcement is about and how it doesn't follow through. They have made some good proposals. What form they take by the time it's time to decide if this is how it's going to stay and they send it off to the Senate, we'll see. But that's the process they see happening. Now, agency assessments are down to 300 days from 365. And panel reviews are 600 days down from 720, 2 years. The difference between a designated and non-designated project. Well, designated means that it's basically brand new. Nothing's there. Nothing's ever been discussed about the site or what's going to go on it. Non-designated is one that does not by law require a federal assessment. If you're replacing culverts, if you're building new dock buildings where existing ones are. Now, a single federal agency will lead all impact assessments for major projects, whereas currently there are 3. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency would become the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and be responsible for leading all assessments and coordinating Crown consultations for all federally designated projects. The idea is this builds trust, reduces confusion, and ensures the approach is consistent. This agency would draw on the expertise of other bodies as required, including the new Canadian Energy Regulator, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and something that is new that even Harper didn't put in, offshore petroleum boards. This has been a bit of a surprise to some people. But with the message of inclusion and listening to everyone, you have to keep in mind that that includes big oil. The Minister of Environment and Climate Change would appoint a review panel to assess designated energy transmission and offshore projects and would integrate the expertise of these life cycle regulators. Now, what is the project list? The project list identifies projects that have the potential to pose significant risks to the areas of the environment that fall under federal jurisdiction. Now, the key features that they see it are proactive, strategic, and regional assessments would evaluate big picture issues. Climate change, biodiversity, species at risk. The cumulative effects of development and provide context for impact assessments. Just the issue itself of strategic and regional assessments is a very good idea, but it's not overly well defined. That seems to be a common complaint on most of this 412-page monstrosity. It brings things up, but then it doesn't tell you what they mean in a legal framework sense. An early planning and engagement phase for all projects would build trust, increase efficiency, improve project design, and give companies certainty about the next steps in the review process. Okay. Who's responsible for it? Who pays for it? Who decides when it is, where it is? Again, one of the first things they use to promote their idea is how it will help those applying for an impact assessment. The only side of the argument that gets to take as long as they want at any specific point in the process is the applicant. There is an awful lot of talk. Oh, hang on. Sorry, I had to cough. Now, there is an awful lot of talk about putting in phrases, putting in definitions, developing processes that sound very logical and noble, but when you want to bring new things into the picture in a process, you have to identify what those things are. And the biggest complaint that seems to be common about C-69 at this point is there are too many definitions missing. Now, one of the first things that came out in response to C-69 came from miningwatch.ca. Do a very good job of keeping an eye on all governments. On February 9th, there was an article by Jamie Kneen, and right off the bat, he says it's hard to respond definitively to a legislative package that's 412 pages long, including the impact of the Navigable Waters Act, Canadian Energy Regulator Act. But he says perhaps some of the energy that went into developing snazzy social media promotions should have been spent making sure the draft legislation will actually achieve its stated objectives. Much depends on whether the draft legislation can be effectively amended to bring it closer to its own objectives and what the key regulations look like. As it stands, the government could well be accused of being interested in a process that will allow it to check all the right boxes: climate change, Indigenous rights, sustainability, gender, without actually opening it up to meaningful rigor and depth of analysis. In this sense, the worst outcome for both sustainability and democracy would be a process that gives the government adequate credibility with enough specific sectors of the public to allow it to make and enforce decisions that may have nothing to do with sustainability and evidence, or climate commitments, or environmental protection, or Indigenous peoples' rights and livelihoods. Now, Jamie here more eloquently states what I was trying to get out. There are a number of aspects of Bill C-69 that are laudable in their purpose, but will require close attention to their wording and implementation in policy, regulations, and guidelines in order to be effective. Gender-based analysis, treatment of knowledge and evidence, both scientific and traditional Indigenous, complete and open information registries, the use of strategic and regional assessments, and an emphasis on cumulative effects, a collaboration with Indigenous governments. These are all promising commitments that do not appear to be clearly and fully implemented in the bill. There are also a number of clear failures. The lost protections on water bodies that were supposed to be restored, according to Liberal campaign promises, to be restored to the Fisheries Act and the Navigable Waters Act don't actually extend to environmental assessment or impact assessment or even just regulation. It's not at all clear that the government will even require a permit and a registry entry for all potentially ecologically damaging projects. This is another issue that you're hearing from certain sectors. We were promised that all the protections for waterways would be restored that Harper removed. They're not in here. And they're also not in C-68, which is accompanying legislation for this that is supposed to deal specifically with the fisheries and oceans folio. But it's not all returned there either. It's great that the government is putting an end to the frustrating spectacle of the National Energy Board, which will now be the Canadian Energy Regulator. And it's good to end the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission pretending to do environmental reviews, despite their lack of independence and competence in running public processes. But Bill C-69 introduces a strange hybrid review panels that are required to have at least one member named by the primary regulator of the project, and makes it worse by adding the offshore petroleum boards to that list. Also in the failure column is the continuation of legislated timelines. Proponents love them, principally because they don't apply to them. A company can take years to submit its information, and some do, while the public, Indigenous peoples, and government agencies are stuck with deadlines that don't take into consideration holidays, weather, or seasonal economic and cultural activity. Timelines are important for proponents and interveners alike, but they should be set out in guidelines to allow for some flexibility. And there needs to be time limits placed on proponents as well. If a proponent drags out a review process too long, the process should be automatically closed, not just suspended. Now, I find that to be a very worthy point because, as we saw with TMX, the process was suspended at a time when Kinder Morgan refused to come back and meet. If an intervener refuses to appear, guess what? Thanks for coming. Now, right here, Jamie says something that I've found looking at this, what I've seen so far. C-69's criteria for decision-making are also problematic, mostly because there aren't any. Contribution to sustainability, adverse effects and mitigation, impact on Indigenous rights, and climate change are all merely considerations. There is no attempt to set out criteria at the generic level or to require them at the project-specific level. In this case, for example, you may say you want to make decisions based on sustainability, but if you fail to set out actual sustainability criteria and hard limits on trade-offs, for example, he says, no, you don't get to destroy that glacier just to make some money, even if you're only going to hire disadvantaged local youth. It doesn't cut up. And you end up with the same old self-interested decisions. You can include broader factors in your impact assessment: social, cultural, economic, ecological, but with nothing to restrict the political decisions at the end of the road, you effectively lose even the limited existing environmental significant adverse effects test. Now, to be fair, the government is proposing to make those decisions much more transparent and accountable, not by handing them over to an independent commission or tribunal. That's just too open, but by providing public reasons for decisions. Now, again, he says, to be fair, if the law were well written and properly implemented, this would be a big step forward. But taking into consideration a bunch of important things in making a decision is not the same as following defined criteria and conditions. In a nutshell, C-69's top-line principles and commitments are laudable, but their execution falls short. Whether that gap can be closed through the parliamentary amendment process and whether the government actually wants to close that gap remains to be seen. Now, I think that is a big, big part of what nobody wants to talk about. Do they want to close that gap? Well, I don't know. We'll have to see. I mean, for such a monster piece of legislation, what have you heard about it in the corporate media? Not much. Is that because they just don't want to talk about it? Well, yes, to a certain extent. I imagine that's going to change as things in Burnaby continue to heat up with Elizabeth May and Kennedy Stewart being arrested. There will be many, many more. I'm sure there will be more members of Parliament that will be quite willing to make that statement, especially once the House rises, and things will really be happening, if Kinder Morgan can stay solvent, that is. But what Jamie talks about in that column on miningwatch.ca is the top-heavy approach to selling government bills. This, again, I have to say this reminds me an awful lot of the Electoral Reform thing. Oh, we've done all this work. We've talked to so many people. We listen. We care. We listen. What did they do with it? They sat on it. They suppressed it. They said there was no direction. No, it just simply wasn't a direction you would prefer. So that's it. We're done. That can't happen with a new environmental approval process. It just simply can't happen. And it's politically impossible to keep things going the way they were. They've already gone too far to maintaining status quo when they brought in their temporary principles leading up to C-69. There will be no way back from this. Sooner or later, whatever comes out of this process of C-69, this will be the new environmental impact assessment regime So how does it get made better? How do these things that, as more people have a full assessment of it, are saying are missing? That's going to be, as usual, up to organizations. I mean, I know Council of Canadians is on it. There are other specifically environmental groups that I'm sure will be all over it. First Nations. And we'll also be hearing from the other side. We'll be hearing from the Kinder Morgans. We'll be hearing from the BPs about what they think this direction is. Like I said, there's an awful lot to this, and I'm just going to skim it. I'm not even going to go into the Canadian Energy Regulator on this show, because just forget it. Can't do it. Especially with just me. If I have success in, recruiting the guests that I wish to for this subject, we can get into a lot more specifics down the road. There's something I added in the last couple hours before the show that's on the bottom of the show page, and it's a website that the Canadian government has put up, and there's 2 PDF documents on there that you can read or download, along with other things. And right on the first page, it says, "We want your views," on both of these documents. One of them is about the information requirements and the time management regulations that are proposed for the Impact Assessment Act. It's worth looking at if you're interested in this subject. Again, as Jamie Knapp said from Mining Watch, if you want these things to actually have the teeth that they're telling you they have, then people are going to have to get involved. The other one is the approach to revising the project list. As in British Columbia, the Clark government decided that the Site C dam did not have to go before the British Columbia Utilities Commission. The same issues exist federally about the project list. I mean, that's the easiest way to get something around a process. Just say it doesn't apply. So again, this is a process that they're asking for input. The worst thing that could happen is for nobody to give input. At least even when people give it and it's fully ignored, there is a record of it and there is a price to pay. Even seasoned environmental lawyers are taking their time and coming out with their opinions and reviews of C-69 in pieces as they can get to it, as they can check the angles. And just like was mentioned in the previous article, when you don't define anything, it makes it a lot harder to come up with a coherent analysis or response. Is that by design? Well, again, if you want to go back to the electoral reform issue, mydemocracy.ca website, 30-some questions about everything but the way we elect people in this country. And then magically the government says we have no consensus. This is the thing that has to be avoided with B69, or C69, sorry. All these big ideas, but define them. Unless you define them, they don't mean anything at the end of the day, or they can mean everything at the end of the day. That's not a good thing. The Impact Assessment Act will be replacing the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012, which was in omnibus legislation. I believe it was I can't remember, C-38? Regardless, this is when the Harper government decided to take protections away, make very strict guidelines, decide what was important and what wasn't. And that is the process which gave us approval for Trans Mountain expansion. Now, even if you want to go back to those clips I played from Minister McKenna, this is the fault, the inherent falsehoods that are presented to the public all the time on exactly what these projects are. I'm not even going to go into that. This is the doubling of an existing pipeline. Yes, it is. There is one pipe there now. They're going to double it, which means they're going to put something in right parallel with it, except the little fact that everybody seems to not mention is that doubling is in fact two additional pipes, not one. Never mind. Meinhard Duhl is a professor that deals with the environment and law at Dalhousie. All of his opinions and reviews and very solid critique of not just Bill 69, but other things can be found at blogs.dal.ca. That is the server for Dalhousie University. It was early February when C-69 first came out. Since then, Professor Duhl has come out with 4, 5, 6, 7 different papers, reviews on different parts of C-69. It's much more nuanced and specific than the article I quoted from Mining Watch and Jamie Kneen, but it says the same things. I think everybody should be made aware that something that is as big as the environmental assessment regime in Canada, going forward, especially seeing all the acrimony that we're having now over TMX, there will be more to come. Ring of Fire in Ontario will be coming up for development. There's no doubt about it. There could be more exploration in the far north, more diamond mines, who knows? There could be a new uranium development. in Saskatchewan or the Northwest Territory. And if our climate change agenda is truly so important, and how we will stick to our targets, something we've failed to do for 25 years, despite always saying we will. Of course, the most important will be those involving fossil fuels. I don't think there's anybody who's on either side of the issue out there that's reasonable that does not agree that that key word is transition. But part of the transition is starting the transition. I see very little effort to do that from any level of government beyond municipal. There are different reasons for that. Some are the same, doesn't matter where you go. Some differ. A federal law for environmental assessment and approval should be cornerstone. It should set the standard. What Harper did in 2012 certainly did not, well, it set a standard, but it's not the one we're looking for. This promotes a standard, but it doesn't define it at this point in time. Now, I'm going to have the occasional silence as I go through Professor Dule and his assessments. But his first one was February 9th, pretty much as soon as it came out. Now, he offers his assessment of what he considers to be some of the key elements of Bill C-69. It's an effort to put in layman's terms how the proposed act would work and how it would differ CEAA 2012. Now, the first thing he looked at was the triggers and the application of the assessment process. How does this stuff even get put on this timeline? Professor says the triggering process for projects has not changed significantly from CEAA 2012. The starting point is a designated projects list. The minister can, on request or on her own, require a project to be assessed that is not on the list by criteria. One limitation is that there is no power to require an assessment of a non-designated project that has substantially begun or that has already received federal approvals. Again, this brings us back to the issue of TMX and why the Trudeau government refused to reopen the process to make the decision. This is something new. It's being put in law now. That was a decision that the interim measures allowed for. Now, in the new law, if something ever comes along again like Trans Mountain, where, well, we've already got the entire assessment done, you want to change the parameters, now in the law, you can't do that. Once it starts, it operates on the rules it has when it starts. That's it. That is a new provision. Impact Assessment Regulations.ca. Now, the planning phase is a new phase introduced in C-69. It starts with a project description prepared by the proponent in accordance with the regulations. The idea is clearly to initiate the process early, but it's not clear how this goal will be achieved. In fact, the timelines may discourage a proponent from initiating the process until fairly late in their own planning process. And there are no legislative provisions to motivate an earlier start to the process. Ultimately, the timing of the initiation is left to the discretion of the proponent. No change there. Now, it would appear that the purposes of the planning process are to decide whether to carry out an assessment, whether and how to cooperate and coordinate with other jurisdictions, what the scope of the assessment will be, and perhaps whether the project itself, should have a standard assessment or a panel review. A key change to scoping includes the addition of a number of factors to be assessed in Section 22 of the new law when compared to Section 19 of the old law. Among the notable additions are the need to consider impacts on Indigenous communities, impacts on Indigenous rights, the need and purpose of the projects, alternative means and alternatives to the project itself, the project's contribution to sustainability, the results of any regional and strategic assessments, the impacts on the intersection of sex and gender with other identity factors, and the impact of the project on environmental obligations, including climate change commitments. Now, the scope of all these factors determined by the minister for panel reviews and the agency itself for agency assessments. The public will be involved in the scoping. So again, there's a whole lot of factors that are included that were never included before for consultation. But when the agency itself will conduct a review, they decide what the scope is. When there's going to be a panel assessment, the minister decides what the limits are. So again, what's really changed? Not a whole lot. This is the problem that has come up time and time again in public inquiries and commissions of all sorts. I can talk about what happened in Newfoundland with the death of Don Dunphy inquiry. When the parameters were set for the inquiry, there were people that said, well, we know what's going to happen already. Because the parameters of the inquiry were set to avoid key things that interested stakeholders wanted to have looked at. They were tossed out before it even began. So I can see the underlying possibility that the same thing can happen no matter what this law ends up looking like. As long as the Minister of Environment and Climate Change is the one who decides what the parameters of review are, despite all this stuff that may come in from this planning process, what's the point? The agency itself decides whether it has enough information to proceed with an assessment. And this is the one and only place where the existence and the results of a regional or strategic assessment can be considered. The decision whether to refer the project to a panel review is a separate decision made by the minister. And at that stage, the minister can also decide that the project will be rejected without an environmental assessment. So this opens the door that you can have this new planning process and people can step forward and they can present and they can make their viewpoints known. They can lobby for what they see as issues, and this will be collected in good faith, but yet there is nothing in the law that specifically says if it has to be paid attention to. Reams of data can be supplied to the minister, but there's nothing in the law that says the minister has to heed it. Now, at the end of the planning process, the options are essentially these: no process with approval or rejection of the project, the standard process laid out, a substitution to an indigenous process or a provincial process, basically the federal government handing it off, or a review panel. So if it's a standard process, that means it would be an agency process using the Impact Assessment Act. Now, this is basically not changed from what we have from 2012. Now, the scope has been broadened significantly, but the timelines are shorter. Though the concept is, with enough time for the planning phase and a 3-year window for the provision of information by the proponent, that won't be an issue. Now, the general impression left from Bill C-69 is that the agency, the Impact Assessment Agency, will be more front and center in the assessment, and the proponent will play more of a supportive role of providing information rather than carrying out a preliminary assessment, as has been the case to date in the form of environmental impact statements. Bill C-69 does not use the term impact statement. The proposed new act continues the recent trend towards strict timelines to decide whether to proceed with a panel review and to carry out such. Decisions to refer a project to the review panel are to be made within 45 days of the commencement of the assessment. Now, there is a section that allows the minister to seek additional information at the conclusion of the panel review process before the minister or cabinet makes their decision. That's after the fact. That's after the fact of the entire process has come along and a panel has looked at everything they have and they've made their recommendation. Now it's in the minister's hand. Now, if the minister was to use Section 56 to seek additional information from the applicant only, interveners, any information that is submitted at that point would not be available to the independent review panel and would not be subject to the same level of public scrutiny through the entire process. Now, the role of a panel in informing the minister or cabinet's public interest finding, such as through a recommendation or conclusion as to whether the project is in the public interest in the view of the panel, is not set out in the bill. The bill does not define what a panel will report to the minister to make her decision. There are no guidelines for what they must say. Does it do this? Does it not do this? It's not even in the law. Now, compared to what we have, there's a clear difference in tone and preference in favor of cooperation. But the main substantive change is the elimination of equivalency. There are no clear provisions to support or encourage cooperation over other forms of harmonization. The elimination of equivalency means the federal government now clearly retains decision-making responsibility, but project decisions can in some cases be made based on information gathering and assessment carried out by another jurisdiction. It's important to note that the shift to broader sustainability considerations adds much more value judgment to the assessment process, raising questions about the appropriateness of federal decision makers relying on provincial assessment and analysis. Strategic and regional assessments. Something new. Now, Bill C-69 allows the minister to initiate them. Neither is defined. Regional assessment can be on entirely federal lands or outside federal lands. If it's completely outside federal lands, a cooperative approach is clearly preferred under Section 93, but a federal-only regional assessment remains an option. Project assessments, the ultimate decision to be made is whether a proposed project is in the public interest. Public interest decisions would need to articulate which areas of federal jurisdiction are impacted by the project and separate these impacts from other broader impacts and benefits that could be taken into account in deciding whether to accept the impact. Now, Section 63 of the Bill C-69 provides a list of factors to be considered in determining whether a project is in the public interest. Many but not all factors are also included in Section 22 as factors to be considered in the assessment. Now, Section 63 includes the extent to which the project contributes to sustainability, the extent to which effects on areas of federal responsibility are adverse, the implementation of mitigation measures, which are defined to include compensation, the impacts on Indigenous communities and Indigenous rights, and the impacts on Canada's environmental obligations and climate commitments. Hang on for one sec. Now, the decision maker, whether the minister or the cabinet, has to give reasons for the decisions to demonstrate that these factors were considered. There's no clarity on the level of detail to be provided or the underlying analysis. There is no opportunity provided in Bill C-69 to appeal or otherwise review the decision or its basis. So again, what Professor Dula seems to be saying is high ideas, show me where it's going to happen. Now, the next piece was not only Professor Dula from Dalhousie, but also Professor John Sinclair from the University of Manitoba. They said, what is meaningful public participation? Now, this has been a goal of environmental assessment processes for a long time. The implementation has, however, been mixed, and the federal assessment process is no exception. While jurisdictions have struggled to reform their environmental assessment processes over time to improve public participation, the role of the public in environmental assessment has evolved significantly. As the focus of environmental assessment has shifted from a technical exercise predicting biophysical impacts to a consideration of a full range of social, economic, health, and cultural impacts of proposals, The need for effective and meaningful public engagement has become more and more pressing. This is where the professors say that there has been one good thing that came out of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. That is something called a multi-interest advisory committee. This concept is missing in Bill C-69. Now, this expert panel that the Liberals refer to, with 14 months of gathering, what did the expert panel say about public participation? The expert panel offered 3 key recommendations on how to improve public participation in the assessment process. The legislation should require that impact assessment provide early and ongoing public participation opportunities that are open to all. Results of public participation should have the potential to impact decisions. The participant funding program for impact assessment be commensurate with the costs associated with meaningful participation in all phases of impact assessment, including monitoring and follow-up. Legislation should require that impact assessment information be easily accessible and permanently and publicly available. Most of the attention so far has been on the fact that Bill C-69 removes the standing clause from CEAA 2012, thereby restoring the right of any interested member of the public to participate in the assessment process. Of course, there are many other provisions in the bill dealing with public participation, from the purpose section to notice requirements, opportunities for public input in the various phases of the process, access to information, and participant funding. Now, the main changes to public participation are the elimination of that standing test and the opportunity for public participation in the new planning phase of the environmental assessment process. The 2 professors identified the following additional changes that they feel are needed to provide a proper legislative framework for meaningful public participation. The term that's used throughout C-69 is public participation. It's littered through it. Public participation. What does that mean? The 2 professors recommend adding one word throughout its usage. Change it from public participation to meaningful public participation. Now, meaningful public participation establishes the needs, values, and concerns of the public, provides a genuine opportunity to influence decisions, and uses multiple and customized methods of engagement that promote and sustain fair and open two-way dialogue. See how much difference one word can make? Many of the critical decisions about the assessment will be made during the planning phase, including whether a full assessment will be required, what the scope of the assessment will be, information will be gathered to inform the assessment, and what process option will be selected by the agency or by a panel. Meaningful public engagement will be critical to to the credibility and effectiveness of this phase, and for the assessment as a whole, to ensure an appropriate legislative framework for meaningful public participation in the planning phase. They recommend the following. Recommend a requirement to initiate the planning phase by establishing a multi-interest planning committee to include representatives of all interested jurisdictions, affected Indigenous communities, local communities, and organizations that represent key stakeholders and public interests. The selection and precise role of non-government members, including the proponent and members of the public, should be set out in regulations. We feel this is the best way to effectively and efficiently engage the range of interests in the early planning phase. It will coordinate input in this phase, ensure there are meaningful opportunities for input, and will enhance the steps of the process that follow. Again, their concerns with the assessment process are these hard limits. I would tend to agree that setting hard limits for every project under the sun may not be the wisest way to go about this. Some may need 30 or 60 days, and they're good. For some, 300 days is going to be a problem. The solution that the professors offer is, again, very simple. Set 300 days as a default, but allow the appropriate timeline to be set by the agency on advice from what they want to see implemented. The MIPC, which is in the planning phase. They recommend the same for the review process. The 600 days be a guideline, a default, but it can be changed by advice from the MIPC in the planning phase. The other thing they recommend is, even with this so-called public input going to be measured, how will it evolve? How will you establish a threshold where you can say, yes, meaningful public consideration and input was achieved? None of these things are defined in the law. They are referred to as worthwhile points to achieve. But there's nothing to say how. What about panel reviews? How will they change under the Impact Assessment Act as compared to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act from 2012? There's been a trend over the last few decades to reduce a review panel's role in determining the scope of assessment, with the minister gradually taking over the role of making scope determinations in the form of the terms of reference for the panel and the guidelines issued to the proponent. Both are now finalized before the panel is even appointed. There's been a trend toward imposing legislative timelines on review panel processes. There's been a trend away from asking panels to offer overall recommendations and conclusions. There's been a trend toward joint review panels that include other interested jurisdictions and their regulator. And there's been a trend toward fewer review panels using substitution and other options to reduce the number of review panels carried out. As you hear the pages flip, 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 there's so much paper, I can't keep track of where I've got highlighted stuff and where I don't. As more paper flips. There are a great deal of issues. You hear the old adage that the more people you let in the room, the more difficult it comes to make a conclusion. One of the main issues of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012 is it very much laid out who was allowed in the room. That is a way to avoid any question of how far anyone's ability or impact can be on a process. If they're not allowed in, they have zero influence. Rightly so, the biggest complaints against the environmental assessment process that Harper brought in was that there was just simply too few people allowed in the room. Legitimate and recognized by the Trudeau government. Now with the Section 22 in this act, with all the things that must be considered, including gender impact assessment, including much more highlighted input from Indigenous, not only on impact, but on traditional values that must be included. The removal of the standing clause that can theoretically give any member of the public the ability to appear before a review, whether it be an agency review or a panel review. They have effectively taken out that doorman that Harper put in. Apparently now the idea is to have it wide open, brings its own set of problems. Okay, everybody's allowed in now. Is everybody the same? Can everybody ask the same questions? Can everybody make the same complaints against applications? What are the rules now that everybody is in the room? Again, as the pattern shows, C-69 does not define these things. But yet, by opening the doors, by saying everyone should be a part of our process if they wish to be, anyone impacted by our process is encouraged to be here. Oh, by the way, the timelines, we shortened them. How does this make any sense? Okay, we're all in the room, so what are we allowed to ask? Who's going to speak to what? What's the process? When do we have to be here? Well, there's no real guidelines on that, but don't forget, we don't have a year anymore. We've got 300 days. Oh, you have a panel review? You don't have 200 days anymore. You have 600. But all these people are available and allowed to be a part of the process now. We want to get a more complete picture for our environmental, it's not even called environmental assessment anymore. It's called impact assessment. Because it's not just about the environment now. It's about the environment, and it's about the economy, and it's about society, and it's about indigenous peoples, and it's about sustainability. Well, okay, what are the rules for all these different criteria? Well, we don't know, and we shortened the process. We codified a shorter process. Oh, and at the end of the day, it's still the minister who decides yea or nay, no matter what. I could go further into specifics, especially from Professor Dula in Dalhousie and Professor Sinclair at the University of Manitoba. There's going to be a lot more. As I will freely admit, I ain't the guy to go into detail on this, not by myself. I will be trying to get Professor Dula to appear on the show. He has got, by far, the most complete review of C-69. He's beyond probably what committee has done, what the opposition has done. So this is going to be a while. Now remember, it was December 2015 that the interim guidelines were put in place, which basically sent the message that don't anybody bother showing up with the big new project until we get our new law, because there's no way to do it. We basically have no rules right now. If somebody showed up and said, I want to do this, I want to do that, well, we don't have a process. Sorry, we'll let you know. So we will have to have a new process. But for all the talk of openness and inclusion and transparency and input and license, nothing's defined. That matters. This is a problem. These are early days, but I think this is another reason why it's not really talked about specifically. It's always talked about in the bigger picture of the environment. Well, it has the power to stretch over everything. And depending on where you sit on the oil sands issue, or the Site C issue, or the Muskrat Falls issue, or the kiosk issue, with basically everybody but the government appointee on the Manitoba Hydro Board stepping down in one fell swoop, it's pretty obvious that environmental assessment has not worked for the benefit of Canada. Any benefits we have gained, which are minuscule, despite on a percentage-wise, Canada gets far less than the corporations who are running the show get. And if you say it's been a benefit to our economy, that's because we haven't had a big disaster. If we do, it's all gone. So that's the issue. Like I said, backgrounder, I'm not going to hammer too hard on stuff tonight. I'm just going to give you an idea. There will be more in the future on this. Like I said, it will be on your national news. Don't worry. It's a matter of time. It'll probably be the fall before this really gets anywhere with corporate media and for process. It's in committee now. Then it'll go to the Senate. Who knows what's going to happen there? Despite all the promises, there's not a whole lot of hurry from this Liberal government to get things done. Are they saving them for the election year? Who knows? We shall see. But for a government that said they would never use omnibus legislation, this is the definition of omnibus legislation. You can fight for it, you can fight against it. I think the easiest way would have for them to just not say something so ridiculously overreaching as we'll never use omnibus legislation. If you don't say it and then you break it, then you can't get nailed for it. Just think before you speak, for Christ's sake. All you would have had to say is, we will not use omnibus legislation in the manner that the Harper government has done. Then you're off the fucking hook. But that's too complex, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, that's it for that subject tonight. As I said off the top, Free Anons is back. And I support the people in charge. Everybody who left, I don't have to say anything. You all know what I think, yeah. It's nice to see the right thing happen once in a while. Ontario released a budget today. There's a very good chance next Wednesday Dave Glover will be back, and we will talk about it. We'll see if any other parties have a plan out by next week. If they don't, we may delay, because the budget is obviously the Ontario Liberal Party's platform. Obviously. If it's not Dave Glover next week to talk about the Ontario budget, the election budget, then it will be a View Up Here Global episode, and very rare occurrence, actually. It will focus on the United States. And my guest will be Stanley Cohen. That could be next week. It could be the week after. I don't know right now. I'll let you know. It's springtime. The third winter is having its last death throes where I am. Looks like it's going to go on for about another 2 weeks. After that, it's gravel and garbage. And then stuff will get green. I hope spring's going a little better for you wherever you are. That's the next couple shows. That's all I want to say for now. I'll say it again. Impact Assessment Regulations. All one word. .ca. You don't input, we can't even tell them they didn't listen. Look into it. This is about our future and Paris and all the other stuff. It's all related. Like I said, there will be more shows. Thank you for listening, everybody, to the View Up Here. We'll see you next week. Good night.